What's up, guys? Today I wanted to cover a relevant topic as everyone's getting ready to go in season, and that is what is the optimal training dose in season to maintain all the strength gains, all the muscle mass that you've worked to put on over the course of the off season. This is a very relevant question that we get from our athletes all the time. So I want to kind of go through some of the science, go through our recommendations, kind of simplify it into kind of rules of thumb that you can use in order to know how much you should be training so that you're not reducing performance by being sore and overtrained in season, while at the same time training enough to not lose out on those strength gains and that muscle mass that you've gained over the course of the off season. So let's get to it. The first study we're going to looked at untrained individuals who initially went through a 16-week training period where they trained their lower body for 3 to 4 sets and 3 separate exercises 3 times per week. So what that looks like is they were doing 9 sets of 8 to 12 reps 3 times per week, which came out to 27 total sets for that muscle group. What they then did was examine what is the effect if we then go and have them do either a third of that total volume or a ninth of that total volume. So what that looked like, a third of the total volume is simply cutting it down from 3 times per week to 1 time per week. And 1/9 of the total volume was cutting it down from 3 different exercises, 3 sets of each, to 1 exercise, 3 sets of that 1 exercise. And so what you actually find is that in these beginners, 1/3 of the total volume actually continued to increase strength slightly and fully maintain hypertrophy, and 1/9 of the total volume no longer maintained hypertrophy, but was actually able to maintain strength. So in beginners, 1/3 to 1/9 of this total volume, or the equivalent of 3 to 9 sets per week for that muscle group, was plenty to maintain strength, and 9 sets being plenty to maintain hypertrophy as well. So the idea being that you don't need a huge amount of volume to maintain strength, at least in a beginner population. The second study looked at endurance athletes, and the authors essentially concluded here that anywhere from 50 to a 70% reduction in training volume was sufficient in order to maintain strength and performance gains from the initial training period. And this particular study was in moderately trained endurance athletes, so not necessarily a direct correlation to baseball players, but again, just giving you an idea of some of the available research. The third study was also on beginners, and the original training condition was 2 exercises, each exercise performed 3 days per week and 3 to 4 sets of 6 to 12 reps per exercise. So the total training volume in this study was 18 to 24 sets per week, and what they did during the detraining period was drop that down to just 1 day per week, 2 exercises and 3 to 4 sets of 6 to 12 reps per exercise. So essentially they dropped the volume by 2/3 to 1/3 of the original training volume, and from 18 to 24 sets to 6 to 8 sets per week. And in this case, that was again more than sufficient to fully maintain the strength and hypertrophy that those beginners saw in the initial training period. So dropping down to 1/3 of the total volume was plenty to maintain their strength. The fourth study was actually on pro soccer players, and this study went through an initial training period, and then it compared whether a once per week maintenance phase for the course of a 12-week season or a once every other week training frequency would be sufficient to maintain strength, jump height, and 40-meter sprint performance. Interestingly, once every other week was actually not enough to fully maintain their gains that they had made, but once per week was. So in this case, dropping training frequency down to once per week seemed to be sufficient to maintain performance, at least in pro soccer players. Another interesting consideration is what happens if you completely take off from training altogether. In other words, what happens if you fully detrain? And in this case, there are plenty of studies that look at this phenomenon. What happens in trained lifters, which is the closest population that you're going to find to most of you guys watching this video, is that in 2 to 3 weeks following total detraining, there is no significant loss in strength or muscle mass. You will see an immediate loss within the first couple weeks of muscle glycogen. That isn't the same as the actual protein content of your muscles. So while you may feel a little bit flatter, that's simply the glycogen depletion of your muscles, and that comes back very quickly. So any studies that do show a very quick loss in muscle mass following detraining, that's actually just glycogen, and that's not actually muscle mass, even though it technically comprises lean body mass. So for about 2 to 3 weeks following total detraining, even in trained athletes, don't expect to see any noticeable loss in strength or muscle mass. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but that's especially important towards the end of the season, especially if you're feeling a little bit burnt out. That's a really good time to kind of take this into consideration, that you're really not going to see much of a difference if you kind of stop training or drop the volume significantly at the very tail end of the season. We're getting into what we have found a lot of success using with our own athletes, which again falls into this generally outlined range of anywhere from about 50 to 70% of a training volume reduction is sufficient to maintain strength. So we like using about 50% volume reduction. We found that to work really, really well. So an example of what that would look like for us. So something like 9 to 12 sets, anywhere from 5 to 10 reps, might be an off-season training rep range for a given muscle group, done twice per week. So 9 to 12 sets of 5 to 10 reps. Broken down, this might look like 3 different exercises and 3 to 4 sets of 5 to 10 reps on each workout. The way that we break that down in season would be maybe 1 day per week, drop that down to 6 sets of 5 to 10 reps. And the other day, drop it down to 3 to 6 sets of 5 to 10 reps. So over the course of the week, essentially what we're doing is taking that total training volume from 18 to 24 sets all the way down to 9 to 12 sets. So cutting the volume in half, the length of the workouts therefore drops in half. When we look down here in this left corner, what this looks like from a practical perspective in terms of individual exercises. So for example, 3x6 on squat, what does that turn into in season? Well, for 3x6, that's going to turn into 1 to 2 sets of 6 reps. That means warm up to 1 to 2 heavy sets of 6 reps. Your warm-up sets don't count as your actual work sets. So for the sake of this, we're talking about work sets. What does 4x8 in the off-season turn into in season? Turns into 2x8. 3x10 turns into 1 to 2 sets of 10 reps. 3x12, 1 to 2 sets of 12 reps. So you can see how that goes. We're basically cutting the number of sets that you perform in half while maintaining a very high intensity. So we're going to kind of summarize everything we've talked about down here in red. 50% reduction in training volume, basically cutting the number of sets you're doing in half, not really changing anything else. As far as intensity, some guys like to maintain the same intensity they would in the off season. I recommend on the conservative side, dropping the intensity by about 10%. So if you might normally do 3 sets of 6 with, let's just say 100 pounds on a given exercise, that drops to 1 to 2 sets of 90 pounds on a given exercise. A big mistake a lot of guys make in season is thinking that they have to drop both volume and intensity. So you can tell, you know the guy who goes super, super heavy in the off season, a ton of volume, and then in season they're doing almost no weight, 135 on the bar, 45-pound dumbbell bench, and they're dropping the volume. And those are the guys that end up losing 15 or 20 pounds over the course of the season. Or if they don't, they end up having a huge decrease in the quality of their body composition and in their strength levels. So keeping the intensity high is extremely important. Dropping the volume significantly is extremely important. And then finally, utilizing the information from this last study that, again, we do have a certain amount of time before you actually start to experience strength and muscle mass decrease, provided you are maintaining properly, is over the final 2 to 3 weeks of the season, this would be a really, really good time to drop that volume of your training even further. So not necessarily not training at all, but if you're, and a lot of teams already do this, but if you guys are going to make a playoff run, if it's mid or late August, and you're in a pro season, this is a good time to drop that volume even further, try to stay as fresh as possible towards the end of the season, and then get right back into training as soon as the season's over. Guys, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at contact@triathletics.com. And again, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us a follow on Twitter, give us a follow on Instagram. See you next time.